how freedom is to be exercised, whether there are any limits on freedom, how societies are to use the freedom that they have, and so forth. So, and these examples can be multiplied. That is what I meant.
Good, thank you. Lord Orman, yes.
Could I ask the Bishop if he would just give us the observations? He said he had not time to, the hand grenade he rolled onto the floor about unconventional warfare.
Yes, I think perhaps unconventional warfare is a provocative term. I think what I mean is that in the future, conflicts will not be the traditional kind of warfare between nation states. There will be different sorts of interventions for different reasons, perhaps genocide, perhaps because the fundamental freedoms of a particular people are threatened, or whatever it may be. And the international community will be asked in various forms to intervene militarily to prevent this. And this has happened already, it will continue to happen. And what I find lacking in interreligious dialogue these days is any discussion of our traditions about thinking on conflict. So obviously Christians have the pacifist tradition, which we must honor, and also to say that those who take this view must also put their money where their mouth is, or their beliefs, so that they do something for peace and not just go on about it. But of course the major tradition is the just war tradition, and we have to rethink the just war tradition in terms of these unconventional undertakings that nation states, regions, and the international community will have to undertake, whether they like it or not. Now, other religious traditions also have ways of thinking about conflict. Jihad has been mentioned. And one of the great disservices that the jihadists have done, I think, to Islam is to obscure the full Islamic tradition about jihad, which has many different aspects to it, as you know. But particularly in the last 200 years, since the work of Shah Waliullah of Delhi, Muhammad Abdu, and many other Islamic thinkers, jihad was coming to mean the justification of conflict only when Islam is in danger. So Sir Sayyid Ahmad Khan, for instance, and the ulama of India declared that the Wahhabi jihad against the British in India was unlawful because Islam was not in danger. All of that has been wiped out by jihadi sentiment, which is expansionist, which has a romantic view of the Darul Islam, which is fostering a version of jihad which certainly exists in the Islamic tradition, but without taking into account, and this you could say about extremists and fundamentalists in a number of areas, without taking account of the wider historical and theological development of the tradition. So I think some dialogue on these issues would be very important. The Jewish people, of course, have their own way of thinking about conflict, which again has been written about, and indeed as does the Hindu tradition. The Bhagavad Gita is not a manual of pacifism, it is actually a manual for the justification of war.
Okay, and we got about 3 minutes left. Yes, right.
David Orson from the UK. Can I ask Bishop Michael to go further on the reply he's just given about the role of conflict? And tell us why it is that the world was so silent, for instance, during the killing of nearly 2 million people in southern Sudan, most of whom were Christian or people from traditional African religions, as Khartoum sought to impose Sharia law on a non-compliant people in the south of the country, and indeed in Darfur, where other Muslims, but Muslims who are not compliant with Wahhabism, have been annihilated. 300,000 people dead, 90% of the villages destroyed, 2 million people who've become refugees. Why is it we've been so seemingly indifferent to the asphyxiation of the ancient churches, of the plight of the Copts, for instance, in Egypt, the situation of the Syrianis, the Chaldeans? Why is it that we are so remiss in speaking out when in Pakistan, for instance, things like the blasphemy laws have been used to justify the bringing of charges that could have led to the execution of some Christians in that country. Why is it we say so little about the conversion problems that people experience if they convert to Christianity and suffer grievously for that? In probing those questions with Bishop Michael, how does he relate that to his final proposition about fundamental freedoms and our own Trappist vows on the abuse of these freedoms in so many parts of the world?
So why don't Christians care?
Well, I mean, there is a short answer to this and a long one. I'll give you the short one. I was sitting opposite the Algerian foreign minister at a dinner one night, soon after 9/11, and he said, for years we've been telling you these people are terrorists, you've been telling us no, they are refugees. In other words, the chickens have come home to roost. And the reason we are discussing all of this today at all, let me be quite blunt, is because of what has happened in the West. Until that happened, nobody cared. The ancient churches were put under pressure, Christian communities in the Holy Land were reduced. You have given us all the instances, what has happened in Indonesia, for instance. But it is only because the West is now affected directly that people are thinking about what has happened to many people for centuries.
Okay. Thank you so much. Well, there's one more gentleman who's been trying to get the floor here, so yes, we'll take one more.
John Marks, Education Research Trust. I would like to thank the Bishop for that splendid survey of Islamic history and institutions, and I wondered if he would think that it would be appropriate that something like that should be part of the training of everybody who's trained in any of the Christian churches, and maybe an upskilling for those who have not had that in their own training. Would that be helpful? I think it would, but I'd like to know what you think.
I think it would be helpful, but it's asking for the moon. I mean, what ordinands in England get today is pitiful in terms of preparing them for the real world in which we live. And I think this is where your call about rethinking theology for the real world in which we live is so apt. I mean, this must happen, but I'm afraid it's not happening except in one or two places. While I have the floor, Mr. Chairman, may I just say one more thing, which I think I should have said, but didn't say, but which is important for our world today. When the Dhimma was abolished in the Ottoman Empire, I have described how the Christians took a major part, out of all proportion to their numbers, in articulating, for example, Arab nationalism. But this did not happen to the Jews. And the Jews, although they also became citizens in the Ottoman Empire, did not take any part in the development of various nationalisms. And the reason for this, of course, is that in Europe the idea of Zionism had already arisen, and that European Jewry was already active in the Ottoman world and beyond in bringing this vision of a land for the Jews to the Jews of the Islamic world. And so their eyes were fixed already on the homeland, and this is the sort of the glaring gap, as it were. Why did the Jews, who'd been so active in all sorts of ways throughout the course of Islamic history, suddenly fade out? So Baghdad was, even until 1948, 20% Jewish. The reason was the homeland, and of course we all know what happened to the Jewish communities in the Islamic world, by and large, once that homeland had been established. But that is another story. It is, however, a story worth telling and worth hearing.
Thank you, Bishop Michael.